bound and burned with a branding iron. A Lakota chief salved her wounds and gave her dignity. The fire had gone low by the time I heard the horse. Not running, not even walking clean, a kind of staggering that a horse does when it's carrying something wrong, something that shifts its balance and won't sit right, and the animal doesn't know whether to go faster or stop. I knew that sound. I'd heard it when we brought back our wounded from the soldiers at the Powder River, the horse not knowing and the thing draped over the saddle not helping itself at all. I was outside because I couldn't sleep. I had been outside 3 hours. There was a particular quality to not sleeping in the late autumn. The cold came from the ground up through the soles of your feet and moved north through you slowly, and somewhere between your knees and your chest it settled, and after a while you were just cold all the way through, and there was nothing to be done about it but stand in it until the mind quieted or the sky went gray. Most nights one of the two happened before morning. That night I was still waiting. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I was 44 years old that autumn. I had been the leading man of our band for 9 years, since my father's chest wound finally collected what it was owed from the battle at Shell Creek. We were not the largest band along the river, 31 people, 11 men who could fight. What we had instead of numbers was a reputation for being left alone, which I had built by being reasonable when reason worked and being something else when it didn't. The whites in Forsyth had learned that. It had cost us both something to get there, and neither side had forgotten what the cost was. The horse came over the low ridge to the east and down the slope toward the creek, and I could see the shape of it in the starlight. The thing draped over the saddle moved once, one arm falling, and then was still. I walked out. It was a woman, white. She was folded over the saddle on her belly, hands tied in front of her, feet tied behind, a length of rope running between them under the horse's belly to keep her from falling. Whoever tied it knew what they were doing. Knew how to keep a body on a horse without caring whether the body could breathe properly or not. Her face was turned sideways, one cheek against the horse's ribs. Her mouth was open. She was breathing, but the breathing was thin and quick and scared, like a rabbit that has given up running. I cut the rope between her hands and feet. I lifted her down. She didn't fight me, didn't have anything left to fight with, but she turned her face away from mine and pressed it into my chest and made a sound I'd only heard once before, from a man whose leg we'd had to take below the knee. Not a cry. Something underneath crying, where the body has given up on making a sound that means anything. I carried her inside. My wife Winona had died 2 winters before, fever. It had taken her in 4 days, and there was nothing to be done, and I had done everything I knew, and none of it helped, and I had sat beside her at the end and held her hand while she went. And when it was finished, I had gone outside and stood in the cold for a long time. So there was a sleeping place that was empty and had been empty, and I laid the woman there. My sister Chapa came when I called her. She slept light. She always had, even as a girl. And she came in without asking any questions because she was a person who looked first and asked later, which was one of the reasons I trusted her more than most people. Chapa pulled back the woman's sleeve to check her wrist for rope burns, and that was when we saw the arm. There was a brand on her forearm. The skin was still raw. A few days old at most. A circle with a line through it. I didn't know the symbol burned in with something wide and flat, like the irons the ranchers used on their cattle. The skin around it was puckered and weeping and starting to go the wrong color at the edges in a way that meant it needed to be cleaned, or we'd be fighting something worse than the burn before long. Chapa looked at me. I looked at the brand. Then I looked at the woman's face. She had come back to herself somewhat. Her eyes were open. Dark eyes, darker than you expected for a white woman, and she was watching me the way a person watches something they're not sure of yet, not afraid exactly, but measuring. There was still thinking happening behind those eyes. That mattered. I said in English I had some enough. Who did that to you? Her lips were dry, cracked in one place. She said, his name is Harlan Voss. She said it flat. No shake in her voice. The kind of flat that means a person has said a name so many times in their head that the saying of it out loud is just the last step in a thing they've already finished. "He own you," I said. She was quiet a moment, then she said he thought so. I didn't say anything to that. I looked at Choppa and nodded toward the root box in the corner. What Choppa had in that box, the powders and the poultices and the dried things whose names I only knew in Lakota, had saved 3 of my men in the past 2 years. 1 from an arrow through the thigh that went bad. 1 from a chest cold that tried to become something permanent. 1 from a knife wound across the ribs that a town doctor had looked at and then looked away from. I trusted what was in that box more than I trusted most things. Choppa worked on the woman's arm for a long time. The woman didn't make a sound, which told me something about how much pain she'd already been sitting in. What's already there stops surprising you. She lay still and watched the ceiling of my shelter, and I sat across the fire from them and let the work happen. When it was done, the arm cleaned and wrapped in the way Choppa wrapped things, neat and without waste, I asked the woman her name. She said Mara Dunn. I said, "How long were you riding?" She thought about it, since yesterday morning. I woke up tired and the horse was moving. I don't know where he turned it loose or why. Which meant either Voss had expected her to die before she got anywhere, or he'd turned the horse loose on purpose so she'd be found, so he could say he'd freed her when really he was just handing the problem off to whatever she arrived at. Men like that, I'd known a few. They liked the cruelty, but they didn't like owning it. "You have people," I asked, "family, somewhere to go?" She looked at me. In the firelight, her face was pale and the dark circles under her eyes were deep. She looked like a woman who had been living on nothing for longer than just the past 2 days. She said, "No." She said it the same way she'd said Harlan Voss's name, flat, already finished with it. I want to be careful how I tell the next part. There are people who would say I was a fool. There are people who said it at the time, both whites in Forsyth who heard about it, and 2 of my own men who told me with their faces, if not their words, that they didn't understand what I was doing. Keeping a white woman, in our camp, with everything the way it was between our people and theirs, the politics of it, the danger. I understood the danger. I had understood it since I was a boy and my father sat me down and explained the world to me the way it was, not the way either of us wanted it to be. I was not operating out of ignorance. What I was operating out of was something harder to explain to people who hadn't seen that arm. There is a particular violation in a brand. It's not just the burning. Anyone can be hurt. I've been hurt: knife, bullet, cold, grief, the usual collection a man accumulates if he lives long enough and doesn't stay still. No, the brand is a declaration. It says, "You belong to me the way a steer belongs to me." It says, "I am making you into property and I am putting my mark on your body so that everyone who sees you knows it." It's a statement about what a person is. And there are things I can walk past and things I cannot. And a man who takes a branding iron to a woman and ties her to a horse and turns it loose is a thing I cannot walk past. So she stayed. The first 3 days she mostly slept. Choppa brought her food, broth first, then real food when she could keep it down, and tended the arm morning and evening. I checked in the mornings to see how the wound was progressing. The bad color at the edges faded by the 2nd day. By the 3rd day the smell had changed, from the sharp, wrong smell of infected skin to something else, something that meant the body was doing what the body does when you give it a chance. She didn't ask for anything. She said thank you when Choppa brought her food, and she said nothing else. Some people get quiet when they're recovering from something bad. It's not weakness. It's the opposite of weakness. It's the mind pulling all its resources inward, toward the damage, away from everything that isn't strictly necessary. I recognized it because I'd done it myself, after Winona. On the 4th day she was up. I came back from riding the south boundary of our territory and she was outside, standing in the thin morning sun near the creek, and Choppa was beside her. They had been talking. Choppa could manage some English when she needed to, not as much as me, but enough. When I came in on the horse, Mara turned and looked at me, and there was something different in her face from the first night. The measuring was still there, but now there was something behind it, something that didn't have a word in English that I knew. In Lakota, the word is closer to, I see you. Not a feeling, not an assessment, just recognition. She said, I'd like to help, if there's something I can do. I got down off the horse. I handed the reins to my nephew Lakota, who was 13 and wanted to be the one who handled my horse whenever the opportunity presented itself. I said to her, Can you cook? She said, Yes. Can you ride? Yes. Can you shoot? She paused, then she said, I can learn. I told myself for a while that I was keeping her there because of the practical problem she presented. Where was she going to go? She had no people, no money, no horse of her own. Voss would be between her and anything in that direction, and even if he wasn't, a white woman alone in the territory in November with winter coming was not a white woman who was going to survive until spring. I was keeping her there because the alternative was worse, and I was doing it because it was the right thing, and because I was the kind of man who did the right thing when he could see it clearly, and I could see this clearly. That was what I told myself. The truth was, and I've had enough years since then to be honest about it, the truth was that she interested me. Not the way she looked, though she was striking once the hollowness left her face and the color came back and she started sleeping real sleep instead of the flat unconscious of exhaustion. Not that. It was how she moved in the world. She watched everything. She learned fast. She never asked a question twice. She made mistakes, and when Choppa corrected her she said nothing, just adjusted, and didn't make the same mistake again. There was a kind of economy to her that I recognized because I tried to operate the same way, no wasted motion, no wasted words, nothing spent on the performance of a thing when the thing itself was available. She learned to fire my rifle inside of a week. Her first 3 shots went wide of the mark. She looked at her hands after the 3rd shot like they'd done something wrong, and then she looked at me and said, again. Not a question. I handed her the ammunition. She shot 6 more times, and on the last 4 she hit what she was aiming at. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. We walked back to camp. Choppa told me that night, with the dry directness my sister had always had, she's going to need somewhere permanent. I said, I know. And she's going to need it from you. Not from me, not from the band, from you. I said, I know that too. Choppa said good and went to sleep. Voss came in December. Not alone. 3 men with him, which told me he'd thought about this, and he'd wanted an audience as much as he'd wanted a result. Men like that always want an audience. He came in from the North Road, the one that ran through Forsyth and then out toward the river, and my man Kanji saw them from the high ground and came back to camp at a run. I had time to be standing outside when they rode in. 4 horses, Voss in front, which put him about where I expected. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, gone to fat somewhat, with a beard that had come in patchy, and a coat that was expensive in the way that men spend money to make other men think about how much money they have. His eyes moved around the camp the way I'd seen eyes move, calculating, looking for weakness, and doing it a little too obviously, which meant he'd learned to look confident before he'd learned what confidence actually was. He pulled up 10 feet from me and looked down from his horse. He said, I believe you have something of mine. I said, I don't. He said, a woman, white, goes by Mara. She ran off from me about 3 weeks back. I said, I know who you mean. He waited. I said, she's not yours. The man to Voss's right, young, with a rifle across his saddle, shifted slightly. I saw it. I also knew that 2 Feathers was on the roof of the storage shelter directly behind Voss with his own rifle, and that Kanji was in the trees to the north, and that Kill's Thunder was behind the horses at the far end of camp. I had put them there when Kanji came back to report. None of this had happened quickly or by accident. I had been thinking about this day since the first morning I looked at Mara's arm. Voss said, "She's my wife." I said, "Show me the papers." He didn't say anything, which meant there were no papers, or the papers said something he didn't want me to read. I said, "She came here wounded. I know how she was wounded. I know what kind of man makes that kind of wound." I let that sit for a moment. The kind of man who does that doesn't have a wife. He has a woman who is afraid of him. That's not the same thing. Voss's face had changed. Men whose authority depends on other people being afraid of them. They do a particular thing with their faces when the fear doesn't show up. It looks like anger, but underneath it is something closer to confusion. He wasn't used to being talked to this way, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. He said, "I'll have the law on you." I said, "Which law?" "Forsyth law. You go talk to Marshal Prout. You tell him you want him to come out to my camp and take a woman away from me. You tell him why you want her back. And while you're telling him, I'll send someone to Forsyth to show Dr. Cartwright." I knew the doctor. We had an arrangement. He treated 2 of my men in exchange for things we could provide. What that brand looks like, and what it looked like 3 weeks ago, and Cartwright can write it down in the way doctors write things down, and that piece of paper will exist. Voss stared at me. I said, "Go to Forsyth. I'll be there when you get there." He didn't move for a long moment. I watched his hands. The hands are the thing, the face lies. The hands don't, or not as well. His hands stayed loose on the reins. Then he pulled his horse around and rode north. His 3 men followed. The young one looked back once. I looked at him until he stopped looking back. I stood in the road for a while after they were gone. Behind me from the doorway of my shelter, Mara said, "I heard." I turned. She had a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. Her arm was healed enough by then that she didn't wear the wrap during the day unless it was cold, and the cold had come in hard the past week. She was looking at me with those dark eyes, and she had the look she got sometimes, the measuring look, but deeper now, going somewhere below measuring into something else. I said, "He won't come back." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because he came with 3 men. Men who aren't afraid come alone or come with enough men to settle it. He brought 3 because he thought 3 would be enough to make me back down. When they didn't, he has nothing left. He'll find someone else to be afraid of him. It's what men like that do." She was quiet, then she said, "You knew he was coming." I thought he might. "You had men placed." "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment. The morning light was thin and gray, and there was frost on the ground, and the horses were stamping their feet and making their breath visible. She said, in a voice that had gone quiet and not quite even, "No one has ever done that for me before." I didn't say anything for a moment. I had a habit of not filling silences that didn't need to be filled, which some people mistook for coldness. She had figured out by then that it wasn't. I said, "It's done now." She said, "Yes." She said it like it was more than a confirmation of the morning. Like it was a settling of something larger, a door that had been banging in the wind and had finally found its frame. I will not pretend the months after that were simple. There were my own people to navigate. Not all of them wanted her there. One of my men, Hoka, who had lost a brother to white soldiers 7 years back and had not separated that grief from all white people since, came to me in February and said what he thought plainly, which I respected even if I didn't agree with it. I told him, "She is here. She is under my protection. If you cannot live with that, tell me now, and I will help you find a place with another band who will take you well and honor what you know." He didn't leave. He also didn't warm to her quickly. But he was an honest man, and over time honest men adjust to evidence, and the evidence of Mara Dunn was hard to argue with. There were the practical things. She had skills I hadn't expected. She could tan a hide, having learned it somewhere before Voss. She was good with horses, better than average in a quiet way that didn't make a show of itself. She had some medicine knowledge, herbs and roots, things she'd learned from her own mother who she didn't talk about much. Chapa and she built a working language between them, half English and half Lakota and half something else entirely, a private shorthand that I sometimes overheard from outside and couldn't fully follow, which I was glad of. It meant they trusted each other with things that didn't need me. And there was what grew between her and me. I'll try to say it the way it actually was, which is the only way worth saying it. I had not expected to want anyone again after Winona, not because I had decided not to, but because the wanting itself had seemed to go away. Grief does that sometimes. It doesn't just take the person, it takes the appetite for the next person, and you don't know if it's coming back or not. For 2 years it hadn't come back and I had stopped checking for it. And then there was Mara in my camp, doing the things she did, being the person she was, and the appetite came back quietly, without announcement, the way things that have been waiting tend to arrive. I didn't act on it for a long time, months. The situation had a particular shape. She was here because I'd taken her in. She had nowhere else to go. There was a power in that which I didn't want to operate from. A good thing comes freely, or it doesn't come right. That was something my father had told me, and I had found it to be true in most areas of life. So I waited, and I watched, and I was present without pressing, and I let the situation be what it was without pushing it toward what I might have wanted it to be. What happened was this. It was late spring. The evenings were long again and the light stayed past supper, and there was the smell of green things coming back to the world that you only get in that particular window of spring, before summer heat burns it off. Mara and I had gotten in the habit of walking the south pasture after the evening meal, not every night, but often enough that it had become a habit without either of us naming it. We talked sometimes. Sometimes we didn't. Both were fine. That evening she stopped walking and turned to face me, which was unusual. Usually we walked side by side. She said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Do you want me to leave? In the spring when I could travel, do you want me to go?" I looked at her. The light was orange and low, and it caught the side of her face and the arm that had healed. You could still see the scar from the brand. You could always see it. Some marks don't go away, and this was one of them. And she was watching me with the particular alertness she had when something mattered to her, and she was trying not to show how much. I said, "I want you to stay." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm better with you here than I am without you, and because you are better here than you would be out there, and because—" I stopped. Then I said it plainly, because plain was the only way I knew how to say real things, because I would like to stop pretending that I don't think about you when you're not in front of me. She was quiet, the light was going. She said, "I think about you too. I've thought about you since December." I said, "December?" "When you stood in the road and you didn't move. When I saw what you'd done, the men, the positions, all of it. You've been thinking about that for weeks, for me." She looked at me steadily. "Nobody's ever thought ahead for me like that. Nobody's ever put that kind of—" She didn't finish the sentence. She said instead, "I see what you are, Chayton. I've been seeing it since the first night." I had a lot of practice at not showing what I felt. You develop that practice when you're responsible for 31 people, and showing fear or doubt or want makes things harder for everyone. I'd been doing it for 9 years and I was good at it. I wasn't particularly good at it right then. I said, "What do you see?" She reached out and put her hand on my chest, not clutching, not desperate, just flat against my chest over my heart with the steadiness of a person who has decided something and is done with the deciding. She said, "A man who is good, who has always been good, who has been carrying everything for everyone and has never once asked to be carried himself." I put my hand over hers. She didn't move it. The light finished going and the evening came down. We married in the summer, in the Lakota way first, and then a month later in Forsyth, in front of a justice of the peace who looked at us with an expression I recognized as a man who disapproves of a thing but disapproves of trouble more. There were papers. I wanted the papers because papers were the language of the world she had to navigate, and because I was not going to have a technicality used against her again if I could help it. Voss had left Forsyth by then, gone east somewhere. I had sent the document Cartwright wrote to a man I knew in the territorial capital, a quiet, deliberate act, the kind that doesn't look like anything but sits in a file somewhere and makes things inconvenient for men who would prefer to be forgotten. I don't know what came of it specifically. I know that Voss didn't come back. The summer Mara and I married, my band had 33 people instead of 31. 2 babies born that winter, Choppa's second and Kanji's first. The spring had been good to the pasture land, and we had more horses than the previous year, and the arrangement with Dr. Cartwright had grown into something that gave both sides more than it cost. Hoka had come around, as honest men do. He didn't say anything particular to market. One afternoon in June, he showed Mara a technique for working a bridle that he'd learned from his father, and that I hadn't seen anyone else use. And she paid attention the way she always paid attention, and that was the end of the distance. I was out in the morning early before most people were awake. Old habit from the years alone after Winona, I still woke early, still stood in the quiet before the camp came to life. The habit hadn't gone away. It had just changed its character. Before, I stood in the cold and waited for the mind to quiet. Now I stood in whatever the morning handed me, and I was aware of the camp behind me, the sound of 33 people sleeping, the fires banked low, the horses on the picket line. The particular weight of things that are yours in the best sense, not owned, not property. The weight of what you're responsible for and have chosen to be responsible for. I heard her before I heard her footsteps. Some people announce themselves in ways that aren't sound. I turned. She had a blanket around her shoulders. She was always cold in the early morning. Her blood ran thin, she said. A joke about being from Indiana where the cold was wet and miserable instead of dry and just cold. She came and stood beside me. We watched the east lighten. She said, "Your shoulder." I said, "What about it?" "You've been favoring it 3 days." I had been favoring it. A muscle I'd pulled moving the fence poles in the north pasture. I'd thought I was hiding it, apparently not from her. She moved behind me and worked her hands into the muscle along the top of my shoulder blade, the exact spot, without me saying anything. The pain ran up and then settled, and then, after a while, wasn't there any more. I said, "When did you learn that?" "My mother, when my father came in from working and didn't want to say where it hurt." She was quiet a moment. Her hands kept working. She always knew anyway. I said, "Smart woman." She was. Her voice changed on that just slightly. I let it sit. After a while she came back around beside me and stood with her arm against mine. The blanket was around both of us then, without either of us having done anything specific about it. The east was orange now, and the first of the birds were starting. My nephew Takota's horse made a sound on the picket line, the one that meant it was awake and interested in being fed. She said, "What are you thinking about when you do this? Stand out here." I thought about it. I said, "Everything I'm responsible for." She said, "Is it a burden?" I said, "No." I thought about the word more. I said, "It's when you carry something and it fits right, it doesn't feel like carrying. It feels like having." She put her head against my shoulder, her dark hair against the side of my neck. She said, "I know what you mean." The light came on over the ridge and reached across the pasture and hit the horses and turned them gold, one by one. Takota's horse, Mara's horse, the gray, the one she'd chosen herself from the string we'd taken in April. My own. I said, "That gray is going to be trouble in the winter. Choppa's husband needs to check its right front shoe." She laughed. Not a big laugh, the quiet, private kind, the kind that comes up on you from somewhere real. She said, "Good morning to you too." I said, "Good morning." Her arm came around my waist. I put mine around her shoulders. We stood like that while the light came up and the camp behind us began its sounds. The first fire, someone's child, the creak of a door, Choppa's voice, and then her husband's answering it. All the ordinary machinery of 33 people waking to another day. The scar on her arm was visible where the blanket had slipped. I had stopped looking at it the way I first looked at it. In the beginning it had been evidence of what had been done to her, of why she needed to be here, of the man who needed to be answered. Now it was just part of her arm, part of her. A mark the world had made which she had not let define her. She had not let it define her. That was the thing about Mara Dunn. All of it, the months alone under Voss, the burning, the rope, the horse in the dark, she had lived through it without letting it eat what she was underneath. There are people who come out of damage smaller, and there are people who come out of it the same size they went in. She came out of it the same size, maybe bigger. I had given her protection. I had given her a place and safety, and the knowledge that there was someone between her and the men who would hurt her. That was mine to give, and I had given it. What she had given me, the choosing, the staying, the hand on my chest in the evening light, and now this arm around my waist in the morning, that was hers to give. She had given it freely, to me. I have had days since that I am not proud of, and winters that were hard, and years with grief in them. That is the nature of a life. But I have never had a morning where I stood in the early light of my own land with a good woman beside me and felt that I had somehow gotten this wrong. The land was mine in the way I said, not owned, responsible for. The woman was mine in the same way. And I was hers in the same way, which I had not expected and had not known I was waiting for, and which turned out to be the thing that made everything else make sense. The sun came over the ridge, the day started, I had work to do. I was ready for it.